On the eve of a Trump-Xi summit, the tempo suddenly shifted. Washington escalated sanctions tied to Russian energy, the EU piled on in sync and named multiple on- and offshore companies. A twin squeeze on energy and technology is putting simultaneous pressure on Beijing's oil imports and rare earth leverage. Meanwhile, word from an upcoming meeting in South Korea is that they will talk directly about how to end the Russia-Ukraine war and about nuclear limits. Soybean purchases, supply chain restructuring, and a tug-of-war over chip data, all are on the table. Don't miss the next drop, subscribe and hit the bell. This isn't a single negotiation, but a rebuilding of global power and supply chains. Peace? Or confrontation? In this episode we'll give you the clearest timeline, drivers, and possible trajectories. Beijing has just wrapped the CCP fourth plenum. Before the situation could catch its breath, Trump fired 3 shots. First shot, sanctions. Second, canceling a meeting with Putin. Third, going straight for the CCP's lifelines, oil and rare earths. The US and EU moved almost the same day. The EU announced its 19th sanctions list, 12 Chinese companies and 5 overseas banks blacklisted for helping Russia evade sanctions. The US Treasury immediately signaled, the next round of sanctions is coming soon. What's the message? It's obvious, this time Washington and Brussels are jointly squeezing Beijing's energy windpipe. More dramatic still, the day after Trump announced these sanctions, he said, "Next week, I'm meeting Xi Jinping in South Korea." Talk peace? Or talk confrontation? Trump himself said, "What I really want to talk about is how to end the war between Russia and Ukraine, whether via oil, energy, or something else." I think he'll be very willing. Behind that line lies a 3-way contest: Russia, Beijing, Washington. This is not just a diplomatic meeting, it's a reconfiguration of energy and power. Foreign media describe this Trump-Xi summit as possibly the most dangerous and last crossroads in U.S.-China relations. Because while Trump is blocking Russian oil, Beijing's refineries are being named by the EU. While the CCP touts self-reliance in tech, Trump is buying up rare earth mines to permanently sidestep China's supply chain. The UK's Economist summed it up in one line: this is not negotiation, it's confrontation. Beijing wants to project resilience, but once the fourth plenum communique dropped, the world could see, the so-called tech self-strengthening is really a fig leaf for economic stall. Right now Beijing imports 1.4 million barrels of Russian oil per day, and per Bloomberg, Sinopec quietly halted purchases of Russian crude last week. What does that mean? The pipelines still flow, but the lifeline is being squeezed. The harsher moves are still ahead. The CCP itself announced an anti-dumping investigation into U.S. semiconductor firms, demanding they hand over China sales details, costs, supply chains, and raw material sources. The U.S. side scoffed, "That's not an investigation, that's extortion." The global chessboard has already shifted before any Trump-Xi summit. On one side is Trump's nuclear limits plus energy strategy, on the other is Xi's tech nationalism. The reality: rare earth blowback, oil under constraint, a collapsing housing market, growth down to 4.8%, Beijing is in no shape to fight. This meeting is not about cooperation, it's about who buckles first. Bloomberg: Trump ups Russia sanctions, Chinese firms blacklisted. On October 23, Bloomberg reported that U.S. President Trump said he plans to discuss China's purchases of Russian oil when he meets CCP leader Xi Jinping in South Korea next week. On October 22, Trump announced new sanctions on energy companies tied to Russia. In the Oval Office with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, Trump told reporters, "What I really want to talk with them about is how do we end the war with Russia and Ukraine, whether through oil, energy, or something else." I think he'll be very willing. Echoing Trump's sanctions, EU member states on October 22 reached agreement on the 19th round of measures against Russia, planning to comprehensively tighten restrictions on Russian oil and gas exports, and listing some Chinese refineries and traders for aiding Moscow in evading Western sanctions. EU joins the US to squeeze Beijing's energy windpipe. For helping Russia obtain restricted technologies, including parts for drone production, the EU's new list adds 12 Chinese companies, 3 Indian firms, and 5 banks based in Hong Kong, Paraguay, and Tajikistan. EU diplomats said the text has been approved by member states, with Slovakia dropping its last reservation this week, paving the way for formal adoption. Procedurally, it takes unanimous approval by the 27 for it to take effect. U.S. Treasury Secretary Bessent also said on the 22nd that the U.S. would soon announce a fresh round of sanctions on Russia. President Trump on the 22nd announced he had canceled a planned meeting with Russian President Putin in Budapest. China imports roughly 1.4 million barrels of Russian oil per day by sea, most purchased by independent refineries, including smaller, teapot plants, though estimates vary for state refineries' volumes. Vortexa Analytics estimates that in the first 9 months of 2025, Chinese state-owned firms bought under 250,000 bpd of Russian oil. Consultancy Energy Aspects estimates about 500,000 bpd. Two trade sources said Sinopec's trading arm, Unipec, stopped buying Russian crude last week after the UK sanctioned Rosneft, Lukoil, the Shadow Fleet, and Chinese entities including a major Chinese refinery. Trump wants Xi to buy soybeans, nuclear limits, as strategic core. Before the October 22 sanctions announcement, ESPO crude for November loading had already slipped to a $1 per BBL premium to IC Brent, compared with a $1.70 premium in early October. Trump hopes to get a commitment from Xi to resume purchases of U.S. soybeans during their meeting. Though rare earths remain a concern for Trump, he considers China's export limits a minor nuisance, while tariffs are the stronger weapon. Nuclear limits are Trump's grand strategy. It concerns human peace and safety, so he wants to discuss a nuclear arsenal reduction deal with Xi. In Trump's view, Putin has floated bilateral cuts, and China should be brought into the process. Talks in Malaysia imminent, a new round of U.S.-China consultations. Before the Trump-Xi summit, U.S. and Chinese officials will hold economic talks in Malaysia. On October 23, China's Commerce Ministry said Premier He Lifeng would lead a delegation to Malaysia October 24 to 27 to meet U.S. Treasury Secretary Bessent for talks on economic and trade issues. Reuters reported that before the new round begins, U.S. trade officials said the trip would also discuss controls on rare earth exports. Expectations are low. At best, limited progress may be made on selected topics. U.S.-China at a critical point, a clash of systems and values. Although Trump has confirmed he will meet Xi in South Korea, The Economist reported the meeting is still uncertain. The UK outlet said ties are at a nadir. In recent weeks, both sides have kept up attacks. The US tightened tech export curbs and raised tariffs. Beijing responded with sanctions and stepped up rare earth controls. The biggest difference: Xi's authoritarian regime can sacrifice its citizens' interests to wage a trade war with America. Trump is different. His agenda with Xi includes soybeans and fentanyl. Soybeans concern American farmers' wallets, fentanyl concerns Americans' health. This is a battle of values and systems. The bottomless line CCP, before a U.S. government bound by universal human values, can act with impunity. Trade retaliation escalates. The CCP forces U.S. firms to hand over sensitive data. Thus, in the UK outlet's view, the CCP is showcasing stress resilience, flexibly deploying countermeasures. Some critics argue Trump's taco, Trump always chickens out, has emboldened Beijing. The CCP's refusal to buy U.S. soybeans severely hits Midwestern farmers, Trump's core base. After Trump imposed fees on Chinese container ships, Beijing retaliated with fees on U.S. port vessels. It has also threatened antitrust probes to pressure American companies like DuPont, Google, Nvidia, and Qualcomm. Beijing pushed further, demanding U.S. chipmakers provide sensitive information. On October 22, China's Trade Remedy and Investigation Bureau published questionnaires requiring U.S. semiconductor firms to submit sensitive data about their sales and operations in China, ostensibly to gather intelligence for an anti-dumping probe into certain U.S.-made analog IC chips. Fourth Plenum Communiqué: Economic Malaise, Tech Nationalism Doubled Down. The notice did not name specific companies. Foreign firms involved must list Chinese customers and transaction details, including sales amounts and costs from logistics to warehousing, and provide information on raw material suppliers working with these U.S. chip companies, including cost and profit comparisons in China versus their home markets. Companies will have 37 days to respond. This move comes as trade tensions heat up again ahead of a possible Trump-Xi summit. The CCP faces huge challenges: property crisis, weak consumption, pressure on entrepreneurs, but she seems unconcerned. What the CCP cares about is surpassing America and seizing global governance, discourse power, hence the obsession with tech self-reliance, building an industrial and maritime great power. The just concluded Fourth Plenum Communiqué says the main goals of the 15th Five-Year Plan are technological autonomy and industrial modernization, further doubling down on Xi's tech nationalist line. Economic data flashing red, growth down to 4.8%. The communiqué repeatedly mentions high-quality development, but sets no concrete growth target. Since the pandemic, China's economy has been on a downward slope with no rebound in sight. On October 20, opening day of the plenum, official data showed Q3 GDP up 4.8% year-on-year, the lowest since the same period last year. Notably, when addressing security and cross-strait topics, the communiqué declares the need to achieve the centenary goals for building the military on schedule and advance the modernization of national defense and the armed forces with high quality, to struggle, prepare for war, and build simultaneously, and to promote peaceful development of cross-strait relations and advance the great cause of national reunification. International Watch, the CCP's 15th five-year plan, seen through. The AP reported the communiqué contained nothing new and essentially echoed Xi's prior policy directions: a strong nation and strong military. Gary Ng, senior economist at Natixis, told AP that compared with 5 years ago, the 14th plan, Beijing is ramping up pushes for tech self-sufficiency, income redistribution, and a shift to clean energy. On the coming Trump-Xi summit, Ng said the communiqué signals this: if a deal is to be reached, the CCP may demand more from the US. Who falls first, Beijing or Washington? In other words, Xi shows no sincerity to strike a trade deal with the US. He also appears ready to hold the Chinese people hostage to keep sparring with America. In truth, the CCP keeps stressing tech self-reliance, but it can't stand on its own technologically. In its standoff with the US and the West, the only real trump card is rare earths. Another barely countable chip is pharmaceutical precursors. But none of these carry intellectual property or complex know-how. Seeing Beijing playing with mud again and again, Trump is actively building his own supply chains to sideline China. Global reordering, U.S.EU build a de-China mineral shield. On October 23, the New York Times reported the Trump administration is taking a series of unconventional steps to secure critical minerals for automakers, jet engine makers, weapons manufacturers, and data centers. In recent months, the government has taken stakes in several mining and minerals companies, discussed building a strategic rare earth stockpile, and used price supports and tariffs to bolster domestic producers. On October 20, the US and Australia reached a strategic deal to invest billions in mineral supply. The topic is expected at the G7 meeting in Canada later this month. The real battlefield behind the Trump-Xi summit. Some analysts praise the administration's push to reduce dependence on China, a reliance that persisted across multiple presidencies. Abigail Hunter, executive director of the Center for Critical Minerals Strategy, said the Trump administration has been very proactive in trying to address these issues, but building alternative U.S. critical mineral supply chains will take time. Therefore, the CCP's threat to U.S. mineral supplies will persist. Kurt Campbell, chair and co-founder of the Asia Group and former Deputy Secretary of State under Biden, said Beijing is unlikely to roll back rare earth controls. Accordingly, Treasury Secretary Bessent said at an investment forum last week that the administration will set price floors, conduct forward purchases, and create a strategic mineral reserve to ensure this doesn't happen again. He said the government will seek direct investments in the rare earth sector and other strategic areas. Washington already holds stakes in several mining firms. In July, the War Department agreed to invest $400 million for a 15% stake in MP Materials, which owns a rare earth mine on the California-Nevada border. The company is finishing a Texas plant to supply GM and planning a second to expand output. The administration also recently said it would hold equity in Canada's Trilogy Metals, which proposes copper and zinc mining in Alaska, and in Lithium Americas, developing one of the world's largest lithium mines in Nevada. Industry sources say the administration is weighing further investments and eyeing rare earth magnets, deep-sea mining, and African mines not controlled by China. Some targets are carryovers from prior funding program applicants, others approach the administration directly. In parallel, the European Commission is studying countermeasures to Beijing's recent rare earth export controls and coordinating with G7 partners. Germany's Handelsblatt reported that EU Executive Vice President for Economic Affairs Valdis Dombrovskis said on October 22, if the situation, China's rare earth controls, does not improve, we will assess possible countermeasures. Specific tools aren't yet set, but discussions are ongoing. He added, I just attended the G7 finance ministers meeting in Washington, and